177 young men, 2 decades of silence, one woman who dared to break it inside the most powerful room in America. It wasn't a trial, it wasn't a press conference, it was a congressional hearing like any other, until it wasn't. Because when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood up and asked a question that had echoed in the hearts of forgotten boys for over 20 years, the room didn't just go silent, it stopped breathing. And when she placed a single sheet of paper on the table, just paper, nothing more, history began to shift. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with something far more dangerous to power: the truth. The clip would go viral in hours. The country would split open in days. But none of that was certain in the moment. In that instant, it was just her, standing in a room where the cost of telling the truth had always been silence. Until now. And it all began, like every reckoning does, not with a headline, not with a hero, but with a room full of noise, and a woman who refused to be quiet. The Rayburn House office building isn't known for drama. It's where bureaucracy breathes, where hearings unfold like old clocks ticking through hours of policy and protocol. But that morning, something was different. Room 2261, usually lined with yawning aides and disinterested committee members, was packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters arrived early, clinging to their phones like lifelines. Security was tighter. The air was stiffer. Some said they felt it the moment they walked in. Others only noticed once the cameras began to roll. But everyone, whether they admitted it or not, knew something was about to break. The hearing was supposed to be about ethics in collegiate sports. A bland headline. Another day of rehearsed statements, mutual backpats, and maybe a few viral sound bites for campaign ads. Nothing more. But tucked into the middle row, seated with her posture upright, her expression unreadable, was someone who had other plans. Jasmine Crockett didn't come for performance. She came for confrontation. She hadn't said a word yet, but even in stillness, she commanded attention. There was something coiled in the way she sat, like a wire pulled taut. She wasn't tense. She was ready. It wasn't anger in her eyes, it was precision. Journalists scanned the room, unsure whether the real story had already happened or whether it was still waiting in the silence. Jasmine gave them nothing. No hints, no gestures, only stillness. Calculated, controlled. At the opposite end of the horseshoe sat Congressman Jim Jordan, former assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State. His face was familiar, his stance casual, but his body betrayed him. His shoulders too square, his smile too forced. He'd been through a dozen of these. Denials, dodges, deflections. He was fluent in the language of slippery answers. But what he hadn't counted on, what no one had, was what it would feel like to sit feet away from a woman who wasn't interested in winning points. She was here for something else entirely. The buzz of whispers filled the space between statements. No one looked at their phones anymore. Jasmine hadn't spoken yet, but already viewers watching at home were leaning closer to their screens. They didn't know why, but they could feel it. Something was coming. Not a speech, not a scandal, a shift. Then almost imperceptibly, Jasmine moved. Just a breath. Just enough to let you know she wasn't waiting anymore. That tension, it was lifting. And in its place, something far more unnerving was settling in. Certainty. Not confidence, not arrogance. Certainty. The kind that doesn't raise its voice. The kind that makes you sit straighter without realizing why. What does it take to silence a room full of powerful people? A gavel? A headline? A leak? Number. Sometimes all it takes is a woman who refuses to play by the rules of polite forgetting, a woman who carries something too heavy to ignore, a question too sharp to be dodged, a memory that doesn't fade just because the powerful say they can't recall it. Somewhere in the back row, a congressional aide dropped a pen. It hit the floor with a crack. A senator twitched. A CSPAN camera zoomed in. Jasmine hadn't spoken, but the room was already listening. And then, as if pulled by some invisible thread of history itself, she reached forward, not for her mic, not yet, but for the thick, battered folder resting quietly on the table. No label, no cover design, just paper. Ordinary, forgettable, deadly. That folder had traveled further than anyone in the room knew. Through inboxes, through whispers, through years of silence and shame. It had been folded, unfolded, bent, and buried, until now. The audience watching at home leaned in. Was this the moment? Was this the story? They didn't know yet, but they knew they couldn't look away. Because in that room full of noise, someone had finally decided to speak. Before the cameras, before the headlines, before she became the woman who could silence a room of lawmakers with nothing but the weight of her voice, Jasmine Crockett was just a girl sitting on the cracked front steps of a small Texas house, listening to her father explain why some men get listened to and others get locked out. He was a truck driver, proud of the sweat in his work, and though he never spoke with the polish of politicians, his words stayed with her longer than any law book ever would. "Baby," he said once, cigarette smoke curling in the summer air, "the world doesn't hand justice to people who look like us. We got to carve it out, inch by inch, truth by truth." Jasmine didn't fully understand then, but she remembered the way his voice caught on that last word, truth. It wasn't just about being right, it was about being seen. Growing up black and ambitious in a place that measured worth by silence and obedience, taught her early how to read a room, how to shrink when necessary, how to speak only when invited. But Jasmine had questions. Too many, some said. She asked why the school books told only half the story, why her mother had to carry a second job and a concealed sadness, why people with power always seemed so good at forgetting the damage they left behind. In college, those questions turned sharper. In law school, they turned into weapons. And in courtrooms across the state, she learned how to wield them. Not for applause, not for profile, but for the people who never even made it into the courtroom. Her first client was a woman who had been arrested for stealing diapers. No priors, no voice, no chance. Jasmine won the case, but she didn't feel victorious, just angry that such a case existed at all. Over the years, that anger hardened into resolve. Every eviction notice she fought, every wrongful arrest she challenged, every courtroom where her presence as a black woman in a suit drew both side eyes and skepticism. It all built something inside her. Not a wall, not armor, something else. A quiet fire. It was that same fire that burned when she sat across from police chiefs and was told the data doesn't support racial bias. It flickered in her chest when she watched body cam footage that never made the news. It roared when she entered politics and saw firsthand how often the truth got rewritten, redacted, or politely erased. But she didn't raise her voice. Not yet. She knew how the game worked. In a world that expected her to snap, to rage, to fall into every stereotype whispered behind closed doors, she chose instead to be sharper than they could see coming. Every word deliberate, every pause calculated, every silence weaponized. And so now, sitting in the hearing room, surrounded by the symbols of American power, marble columns, embroidered flags, clipped microphones, Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. Remembering every client, every dismissal, every man who'd been told he was crazy, every woman who'd been told she was lying, every name in the folder before her. Because for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning she'd been preparing for her entire life. The hearing began like dozens before it, stiff introductions, polite nods, and a cascade of rehearsed statements that settled over the room like a heavy fog. The chairman opened with a summary of the agenda. Ethics in collegiate athletics, a subject that sounded noble on paper, but rarely resulted in anything beyond headlines and handshakes. Around the room, aides took notes they wouldn't read. Representatives scanned talking points for phrases that would play well on social media, and cameras rolled with the sleepy precision of routine. Congressman Jim Jordan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded, already prepping for the usual volley of questions he could deflect with ease. He was used to these rooms, had mastered the art of saying everything and nothing in a single breath. And then, without warning, the rhythm broke. "Mr. Chairman," Jasmine Crockett's voice rang clear, not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to slice through the hum of bureaucracy. Heads turned, pens stopped moving. Even the chairman blinked twice, startled. "I'm formally requesting the committee's time to redirect the inquiry," she continued, each word crisp and intentional, "toward Congressman Jim Jordan." A pause, small but deep. Jim Jordan shifted in his seat, slightly, but enough. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone carried the weight of something that had been waiting too long to be said. The chairman glanced toward her, confused. "Ms. Crockett, the witness list for today—" She cut in gently, respectfully, but firmly. "I understand. But given Representative Jordan's direct involvement with Ohio State University during the period under review, and his position of authority within the athletic department at the time of numerous documented incidents of abuse, I believe this committee cannot in good conscience ignore the questions that still remain." The silence that followed wasn't procedural. It was loaded. Jim Jordan leaned forward now, one elbow on the desk, adjusting his microphone as though the machinery might protect him. "With all due respect," he began, already tightening his jaw, "I've addressed these rumors for years. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I never saw or heard anything inappropriate. Ever." He ended the sentence like it was punctuation on the past. But Jasmine wasn't interested in the past as he remembered it. She was here for the truth as others had lived it. She didn't break eye contact, not once. "That's a strong statement, Congressman," she said quietly. "But what this room deserves, is to understand what that silence actually meant to the people who were hurt under your watch." Reporters leaned in. Staffers stilled. One aide accidentally dropped a tablet. It clattered loud against the floor, echoing in the hush that had overtaken the space. Jordan's fingers twitched, just slightly against the mic base. His throat moved like he was swallowing something he couldn't quite name. His confidence, perhaps. And still, Jasmine didn't blink. Because in a room built on decorum and delay, she had just done the unthinkable. Not by yelling, not by accusing, but by asking the one question no one else ever dared to speak aloud. What do you call silence when people are screaming for help? And more importantly, what do you do when it sits just 3 feet away from you, wearing a congressional pin? There is a particular kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from being unheard. For the survivors of Dr. Richard Strauss's abuse at Ohio State, that silence had stretched across decades, not because they didn't speak, but because no one wanted to listen. And now, as the room held its breath and Jasmine Crockett leaned toward the microphone, that silence was finally being forced to answer. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She opened the folder that had sat quietly in front of her, the one no one had dared to ask about, and began to speak. Not her own words, but theirs. Words pulled from depositions, affidavits, forgotten transcripts buried in boxes of legal filings. Voices that had once whispered into locker rooms, offices, and empty hallways, only to be met with laughter, disbelief, or worse, nothing at all. "Testimony number 62, she began, her voice clear, even. "A former student athlete, age 18 at the time. He said, 'I waited until practice ended. Everyone else was gone. I walked up to Coach Jordan, nervous as hell, and said, "Coach, Dr. Strauss touched me. It didn't feel right." He looked at me, didn't even blink, and said, "Don't talk like that. Don't make things up." She let the words settle, not for effect, but because that was how long it had taken for anyone to really hear them. Jim Jordan didn't move, not visibly, but the tightening of his jaw said enough. She read another. "I told him directly. I said Strauss made us uncomfortable in the showers. He laughed and said, 'That's just how it is. Part of the culture.' I was 19. I thought maybe I was soft." The room didn't flinch, not yet, but the air began to feel thicker, heavier, like each word carried the weight of something sacred finally unburied. These weren't stories told for vengeance. They were testimonies given out of necessity, because carrying them any longer was no longer survivable. Some of these men had waited 20 years to say what they needed to say. Some never had the chance. One of the pages in Jasmine's folder included a small handwritten note in the margin. Just 3 words, scribbled in the corner of a typed statement: "He never stopped." And that was the truth that rattled beneath every sentence. Strauss didn't stop. Not after one complaint, not after 10, not after dozens. He kept going because the silence kept holding. And silence in the hands of the powerful is not neutral. It is permission. Jasmine didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. Each line of testimony did the work for her. She read until the air in the room felt like glass stretched thin, moments from shattering. One athlete recalled showering with his clothes on because he was too afraid. Another described crying in the locker room but pretending it was because he'd lost a match. A third wrote, "I started skipping medical checks. I'd rather risk injury than walk into that room again." These weren't statistics. They were lives. Boys who had come to Ohio State believing in the promise of mentorship, the safety of programs, the sanctity of sport, and instead they left carrying shame that was never theirs to begin with. When Jasmine paused, she didn't look up right away. She let the folder close softly, the sound almost inaudible, yet more deafening than any gavel strike. And in that moment, for the first time, the people in that room stopped seeing the issue as political. They saw it as human, because these voices had never truly been silent. They had simply been ignored. She didn't slam the table. She didn't raise her voice. Jasmine Crockett simply reached into the folder and pulled out a single document, held together by time, bureaucracy, and something far heavier. Proof. She held it up just slightly, enough for the cameras to see the bold red letters typed across the top. Ohio State Athletic Department Memorandum, April 4th, 1994. She placed it on the table with the precision of a surgeon. "This," she said softly, "is not an accusation. It's not a rumor. It's a memo, a formal one. And it has a name at the bottom that should concern every person in this room." She turned the page slowly, deliberately. It was sent to the head wrestling coach, 2 assistant coaches, and carbon copied to James D. Jordan. The room didn't gasp. It didn't have to. The shift in energy was instantaneous. The memo didn't scream, but it didn't have to. Its silence had always been its weapon, but now, spoken aloud, its power turned against the very man who once hoped it would stay buried. Jasmine tapped the page with the back of her fingernail, once, twice. Not for drama, but to make sure the sound echoed through the microphones. This wasn't hearsay, it wasn't gossip. This was an internal warning. It detailed repeated concerns about Dr. Strauss's behavior, concerns documented, shared, and sent directly to you. Jordan leaned forward. His hand went to the mic again, this time with less certainty. "We don't know if this is legitimate," he said quickly, voice sharper than before. "There's no university stamp. Anyone could have typed this." Jasmine tilted her head, calm, controlled, cutting. "And yet, your name is right there. Your initials, not spoken, not remembered. Printed." She let that land for a moment, then continued. "Congressman, we're not here to debate formatting. We're here to ask something far more important." She opened a second folder, thinner this time, but no less heavy. Inside were names, each one printed in clean black ink. No annotations, no color, just names. Men who had come forward, who had waited years to be believed. She pulled the first one out, held it up, and read it aloud. "Michael D.," she said. "He was a sophomore, wrestler. He told his trainer. The complaint went nowhere." Another, J. Thompson, freshman. He said he cried in the showers after practice for a month. Alone. Another, Andre W. told his coach, said he was told to man up and get back to work. She looked directly at Jordan. "These boys didn't ask you for policy change. They didn't ask you to go to the press. They asked you to listen, and you were the grown-up in the room." His lips parted as if to respond, but no sound came. He looked down, then back up, then away. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just let the silence do what it always had the power to do when truth was finally allowed in. Break something that had once seemed untouchable. And that's when the first real crack appeared. Not in his words, in his body. His posture, once firm and dismissive, faltered. His fingers curled tighter around the microphone. The man who had built his career on volume, on deflection, on certainty, was now sitting across from a woman who had only ever needed one thing to unravel it all. The truth, spoken softly, and at exactly the right time. Without raising her voice, Jasmine reached forward and tapped a key on the laptop in front of her. The courtroom monitors, until now dark and idle, flickered to life. A grainy video filled the screen. Low resolution, dated lighting, but unmistakably real. The face on screen belonged to Mike DiSabato, former Ohio State wrestler, the first man who had dared to speak publicly back in 2018. His jaw was tense, his eyes exhausted. But when he spoke, his voice rang out with a clarity that no courtroom could dilute. "We all knew about Strauss," he said plainly, "and so did Coach Jordan." He paused, not for effect, but because the memory visibly hurt. "We joked about it. We normalized it. But we were kids, trying to make sense of something we should never have had to." In the room, no one moved, no scribbling of pens, no shifting of chairs. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in tighter, unconsciously. Jasmine didn't glance at Jordan. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. Then came the second clip. Dunasha Yates, younger in the video, but visibly bracing himself like he was preparing for impact. "I didn't tell just anyone," he said slowly. "I told Coach Jordan. I told him what Strauss was doing." He looked down in the video, then back into the lens. He said, "Toughen up." Said it was part of the culture, that I should stop whining. He exhaled once. It stuck with me, because in that moment I understood. Silence wasn't accidental. It was expected. The room tightened. The shift was palpable. This was no longer about party lines or political posturing. This was about pain, unfolding in real time. Jordan, who had held himself with his usual bravado just moments earlier, now leaned forward, face taut. "These claims are from decades ago," he said abruptly, trying to cut through the moment. 30 years. I coached a lot of kids. I can't remember every conversation." But the words felt thinner than they had before. The usual confidence had begun to fray. His voice rose, too fast, too defensive. "If I'd known something was happening, I would have done something." Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. She let the silence fill with the echo of those testimonies. Because what she understood better than anyone in that room was that facts could be denied, evidence could be debated. But testimony reached somewhere deeper. Into the places inside us that still remember being 18, scared and ignored. Jordan adjusted his microphone as if the equipment was to blame for what was unraveling. "These guys, they say things that might have happened 25, 30 years ago. How do you prove that?" But his tone betrayed him now. Not conviction, but desperation. His gaze shifted not to Jasmine, but toward the chairman, the press pool, anywhere else. Anywhere but the screen. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Because the truth didn't need more volume. It needed space. And in that space, the room was no longer a political arena. It had become something else entirely, an altar of accountability. And at its center was a man who had built his legacy on forgetting, now being confronted by those who never could. The screen faded to black. The testimonies were done, but the silence they left behind was far from empty. It lingered in the creases of faces, in the tightened shoulders of aides, in the widened eyes of a nation that had just watched the weight of memory unfold in digital clarity. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The air was already heavy. The truth had made its entrance. Now it was time to show it had always been there. She reached for a plastic sleeve tucked neatly beneath her notes, held it between her fingers like a relic, then placed it squarely on the table in front of her. The document inside looked ordinary. No gold stamp, no wax seal, no government watermark, just typed ink on old paper. And yet the way Jasmine slid it toward the microphone gave it more power than any bill or resolution that had crossed that room in months. "This," she began, her voice steady but quiet, "is not a weapon. It's not a threat. It's a memo. Dated April 4th, 1994. Issued by the Ohio State Athletic Department." She paused just long enough to let the date sink in. It doesn't shout, it doesn't scream, it doesn't even accuse. It warns. The memo detailed what it called a rising pattern of inappropriate conduct involving Dr. Richard Strauss. It included observations from an athletic trainer, concerns about multiple student athletes reporting the same behavior. It was sent up the chain, and it landed in 3 places: the head coach's office, the assistant coach's mail slot, and one carbon copy marked J.D. Jordan. She didn't need to say the name. Everyone in the room was already staring at him. Jordan adjusted his tie, then leaned toward the mic. "Let's be clear," he said, voice firmer than before, but lacking its usual edge. "This document, whatever it is, doesn't carry formal weight. There's no university letterhead. There's no institutional stamp. We don't even know where it came from. Anyone could have typed that." His hand waved vaguely in the direction of the memo, as if touching it would make it real, or worse, make it undeniable. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she turned the memo slightly toward the cameras. The light caught the plastic cover just right, the printed name visible through the glare. "You're right, Congressman," she said softly. "It's not stamped in gold. It's not framed in the president's office. But it's typed, it's signed, and most importantly, it was filed, internally, through your department." Her tone didn't accuse. It convicted. Not by shouting, but by revealing what had always been hiding in plain sight. "You say it's not official," she continued, "but neither were the boys who came to you. They didn't bring notarized affidavits. They didn't wear microphones. They came with bruises, questions, fear, and they were met with silence. The words didn't explode. They bled, slowly, deliberately, like paper cuts, small but deep. The kind you don't notice until the sting begins to spread. The kind that remind you truth doesn't always need to scream. Sometimes it just needs to be read." Jordan opened his mouth as if to speak again, then stopped. His eyes scanned the room. The cameras, the press, the chair beside him, the door. But not her. Not the woman holding the memo that could unravel his legacy. Because now, it wasn't just about what he couldn't remember. It was about what he had been formally told, and what he chose not to do. For a long moment, the room remained suspended, caught between the weight of what had just been presented and the fragile shell of denial still clinging to Jim Jordan's expression. He stared at the memo like it might disappear if he looked hard enough, like ink on paper could somehow be undone by willpower alone. His fingers gripped the edge of the table now, his knuckles whitening. "I wasn't in charge," he said suddenly, his voice lower, less combative than before. "I was just an assistant coach. I didn't have the power to make disciplinary decisions. That wasn't my role." He delivered the words as if they were a shield, small, cracked, but still raised between him and the storm. Jasmine didn't look away. Her response came without delay, not because she had rehearsed it, but because it lived inside her like breath. "You didn't need power, Congressman," she said, her tone even, unwavering. "You needed principle." The sentence landed like a dropped hammer, quiet but unignorable. She leaned forward slightly, not for drama, but for clarity. "Those boys didn't come to you asking for legal strategy. They weren't demanding institutional overhaul. They came to you because you were the grown man in the room, because you had the whistle, because you had the ears of those who mattered." Her voice softened, not in weakness, but in weight. "And you didn't need clearance. You didn't need a committee. You didn't even need certainty. All you needed was the courage to say, 'This is wrong.'" The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was sacred. Not a pause. A reckoning. Jordan blinked slowly. His jaw tightened, but the edges of his facade began to soften. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked less like a man dodging politics, and more like someone who wasn't sure who he had become. Jasmine didn't press. She let the moment breathe, then filled it not with condemnation, but with truth. "You say you don't remember," she continued, her voice now quieter than before. "But they do. They remember the locker room, the look on your face, the moment your silence said more than any answer ever could." He didn't interrupt. He didn't shake his head. He simply looked down, not at a phone, not at a paper, but down in that way people do when the weight of their own choices finally begins to make contact with their chest. She could have stopped there, could have let the image speak for itself. But she understood something essential about this moment. Accountability isn't about theatrics. It's about clarity. Memory, she said slowly, can fade. It can blur. It can protect us from the things we don't want to face. But accountability, real accountability, means choosing to care anyway, choosing to act when you can. And you had that chance, again and again. She paused, her voice now like a scalpel. Precise, deliberate, undeniable. You say you weren't in charge, but to them, you were everything. And in that moment, with the memo still on the table and the eyes of a nation watching, Jim Jordan didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He simply sat there, his face slackening under the weight of something heavier than politics. Guilt. Not for what he did, but for what he didn't do when someone needed him most. Jasmine didn't speak for a moment. She let the last words hang in the air, not because she needed the pause, but because the room did. Across from her, Jim Jordan sat frozen, his hands clasped, his eyes no longer darting, but locked somewhere unfocused, like a man trying to replay history and realizing too late that memory isn't defense. It's exposure. Without changing her tone, Jasmine reached beside her chair and lifted a simple rectangular box onto the desk. It was unadorned, no labels, no markings, just plain, white, and heavy in a way that paper should never be. She opened the lid with the quiet reverence of someone handling something sacred. Inside were 177 sheets of paper. Each one carried a name. She pulled the first and placed it gently on the table. One name, bold, alone. Then another, and another. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. She let the sound of each page hitting the wood, soft, final, say what words couldn't. The names began to form a line across the desk, not in disorder, not in anger, but in ceremony. They weren't accusations. They were people. They weren't props. They were proof. Every name, Jasmine finally said, her voice calm but steeped in something deeper, represents a boy who trusted the system, trusted adults, trusted you. She placed another name down. He walked into a university thinking he was joining a team. He walked out carrying shame that wasn't his. Another. This one was 17. His testimony says he tried to speak up, but he was told to stop making waves. Another. This one became a father and still hasn't told his own son what happened in that room. She didn't look at Jordan. She didn't need to. The stillness around him told her everything. His jaw had clenched. His shoulders had folded inward. The room no longer watched Jasmine. They watched him, not with curiosity, with reckoning. This isn't a list, she continued, barely above a whisper. It's a ledger of failure, of silence, of moments when one voice, yours, could have made a difference. She spread the pages slowly, lining them side by side. These boys weren't numbers. They were names, and those names became secrets. Secrets they carried for decades. Secrets that made them question their worth, their sanity, their right to be angry. A reporter in the back lowered her pen. A congressional aide blinked hard, lips trembling. And Jim Jordan? He didn't move. He just sat there, his eyes now trained on the table. Not on the faces around him, not on the cameras, but on the papers lining up like gravestones between him and the woman who refused to let them be forgotten. You can forget, Jasmine said finally, her voice like stone. But they don't have that luxury. And with that, she placed one more name down. The paper fluttered slightly, then settled, joining the others. A silent army, one name at a time. And still, Jordan said nothing. Because in that moment, what more could be said? The moment Jasmine Crockett uttered the words, "Have you ever said, 'I'm sorry'?" The room had already stopped breathing. But it wasn't until that clip, just 21 seconds long, hit the internet that the rest of the country did too. The silence in that hearing room was like a vacuum, pulled tight around a single question no one had dared to ask, much less demand an answer to. Jim Jordan, once defiant, had blinked, hesitated, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't strength, it was evasion. That single pause, that crack in confidence, became the crack in the dam. By nightfall, the clip had 3 million views. By sunrise, it passed 10. Within 48 hours, it had surpassed 40 million, shared across platforms with captions that range from, "This is what courage looks like," to "The reckoning Congress never saw coming." It wasn't just political Twitter or activist corners of the internet. It was Facebook groups of retired teachers, Reddit threads filled with former student athletes, TikTok stitched with tears, Instagram reels replaying that exact moment where Jasmine refused to blink, and Jim Jordan finally did. And then, slowly at first, survivors began to speak. Again. Some hadn't spoken in decades. Others never had. A man in Oregon, now 56, posted a simple black screen on X with the caption, "I was 20. I told my coach. He told me to pray harder." A former veteran in North Carolina shared a 2-minute voice memo, cracked with emotion. "We were trained to follow orders, to keep our heads down. I watched that hearing, and for the first time in my life, I wish someone like her had been there for me too." One young man, anonymous but verified as a former OSU athlete, wrote in a locked post, "He told me to toughen up. I believed him. For 20 years, I believed I was the problem." Jasmine's words had ripped through layers of shame, not with force, but with precision. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't grandstanded. She had simply laid down the truth and dared everyone watching to look away. And suddenly, no one could. It was no longer about Jim Jordan. It wasn't even just about Ohio State. It became about every institution that had told survivors to stay quiet, every adult who had chosen comfort over confrontation, every person who had ever whispered their story and been met with disbelief. News anchors played the clip on loop. "Have you ever said, 'I'm sorry'?" became a refrain across cable news segments. Some called it grandstanding. Others called it political suicide. But outside of Washington, the people watching didn't see strategy. They saw sincerity. They saw a woman who said what needed to be said, and said it like she meant it. And for once, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like release. Support groups saw spikes in calls. Trauma counselors began holding virtual town halls. Churches played the hearing clip during services. A pastor in Cleveland stood at the pulpit, his voice trembling as he said, "We can't preach healing if we keep protecting silence." And through it all, the clip kept playing. Jasmine's voice, her stare, the paper sliding across the table, Jordan's silence. Because some moments aren't viral just because they're shocking. Some moments go viral because they finally say what millions have been waiting a lifetime to hear. It started with one canceled fundraiser. A discreet update on a Republican donor site noted that Congressman Jim Jordan would no longer be speaking at the Dallas Freedom Summit due to scheduling conflicts. But those who worked in political circles knew better. There were no conflicts, only consequences. Within a week, 3 more events vanished from his public calendar. A youth outreach roundtable in Columbus, a business luncheon in Cincinnati, a televised panel on integrity and public service. The silence from his office was telling. No press releases, no statements, just withdrawal. Quiet, calculated, like a man hoping the storm would pass if he simply stopped moving. His allies on the Hill weren't silent, but their tone changed. Some shifted their messaging entirely, focusing on unrelated issues. Others doubled down on language like trial by media and political ambush, trying to redirect attention, but their efforts fell flat. The public had already made up its mind. The hearing wasn't seen as partisan, it was seen as personal. And every attempt to reframe it as theater only further alienated a nation that recognized something painfully real in Jasmine Crockett's unwavering voice. Supporters who had once championed Jordan now paused. Not all abandoned him, but many began their defenses with hesitation. "I respect Jim, but," became the new preamble. The tone wasn't loyalty, it was survival. Political machines don't bleed, they calculate, and the numbers, 40 million views, thousands of personal testimonies, a hashtag that climbed to the top of national trends within hours, told them one thing. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just delivered a moment. She had detonated a movement. 3 hashtags led the charge. Number Jordan Knew, number Justice for OSU, and the most viral of them all, number Crockett Speaks For Us. That one came not from a journalist, not from a pundit, but from a former high school coach in Michigan who tweeted a clip of the hearing alongside the caption, "She said everything I was too afraid to admit." Within a day, it had over 1.2 million likes and was being quoted by advocacy organizations, survivors networks, and even celebrities. Singer-songwriters wrote lyrics inspired by the hearing. Spoken word artists performed entire sets around the theme of institutional silence and the courage it takes to break it. But this wasn't a trend. It was a reckoning. Advocacy groups that had been underfunded and overlooked for years suddenly found their inboxes flooded with offers to help, to donate, to finally listen. The Survivors Alliance for Collegiate Athletes launched a new campaign called One Voice at a Time, using Crockett's testimony as its centerpiece. A banner on their website read, "For every name she laid on the table, we will lay down the silence." Protests turned into vigils, vigils into rallies. And at the center of it all wasn't a politician, it was a symbol. Jasmine Crockett's calm, steady voice had become a torch passed hand to hand across the country, lighting up every room where someone had once been told to forget, to be quiet, to get over it. Because Crockett hadn't just spoken for Congress. She had spoken for everyone who had waited too long for someone, anyone, to finally say, "I believe you." And in that belief, a new kind of power was born. The night air outside the Capitol was still, the kind of stillness that holds weight. A soft breeze stirred the American flags above, but down below, on the West Lawn, there were no chants, no megaphones, no cameras jostling for dominance. Just candles, hundreds of them. Their flames danced gently in the dark, each one cradled in a paper cup, each one held by someone who had come not for a show, but for something far quieter. Closure, recognition, a shared breath after years of holding it in. The vigil had begun just after sunset. There was no podium, no giant screen, only a folding table with a single microphone and a list of names, 177 of them. Volunteers from the Survivors Alliance stood in a loose circle, some holding hands, others gripping the printed names as if they were afraid the paper might slip through their fingers. One by one, they stepped forward, saying each name aloud, slowly, deliberately, no embellishment, no titles, just names. And after each one, a soft bell rang once, clear and solemn, cutting through the night like a prayer. Michael D. ring, Joshua T. ring, Andre W. ring. From the crowd, a few muffled sobs rose and fell. A woman near the front pulled her scarf tighter, her other hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage boy beside her. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded Ohio State hoodie, stared at the ground with glassy eyes. Somewhere in the middle, a student from Howard University clutched a hand-lettered sign that simply read, "Silence is not neutral." Standing near the back, away from the flicker of the candlelight, was Jasmine Crockett. No press knew she was there. No one announced her. She didn't bring staff or make a statement. She stood alone, her coat wrapped tight against the wind, her face shadowed by the street lamps above. But she was present, fully, achingly present. Her eyes never left the table. Her lips moved silently as the names were read, as if committing each one to memory. She watched as a mother stepped forward with trembling hands and whispered, "This is for my son." He was 17. He didn't think anyone would believe him. The crowd didn't respond with applause. They responded with silence. Not the same silence that once buried the truth, but a new silence, one that honored it. Someone passed Jasmine a candle. She accepted it without words, the wax cup warm against her palms. The flame flickered once, then steadied. She held it close, letting it light her face just enough to reveal the tear trailing silently down her cheek. The last name was read just before midnight. The final bell rang. And then for a full minute, no one moved. The silence was absolute, sacred. And then, softly, quietly, someone in the crowd began to whisper, "Thank you." Another joined in, then another. Soon a gentle chorus rippled through the lawn. Not chanted, not shouted, just offered. From mothers, from sons, from students, from strangers. And in the very back, Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes, whispered those two words back to the wind, and let the moment carry her forward. The Capitol always feels different after hours. The echo of footsteps disappears into marble that no longer listens, and the grandeur that commands attention by day turns somber in the evening mist. That night, the steps beneath Jasmine Crockett's feet didn't announce victory or fatigue. They whispered something heavier: stillness, solitude, and the quiet weight of having said too much and yet somehow still not enough. She stepped through the heavy double doors alone. No entourage, no flashing cameras chasing after her now. The mist that clung to the columns curled around her like smoke, softening the edges of stone and steel. The sky above had turned the color of bruised lavender, and the faint glow of streetlights shimmered across the granite walkway, as if the building itself had begun to exhale. Jasmine didn't rush. Her pace was unhurried, every footstep echoing a little louder than the last. In her hand, she carried the same leather-bound folder from the hearing. She didn't need to look inside anymore. Every name, every word, every silence, it was all etched into her now. She had spoken for them, carried them, and tonight she was ready to let the quiet hold her in return. She reached the base of the steps, just a few paces from the curb where a black car waited, its headlights cutting faint lines through the fog. But then, movement. Not loud, not alarming, just a shape, small, half hidden behind one of the pillars near the rotunda's edge. Jasmine paused. Out stepped a boy. He couldn't have been older than 14. His coat hung oversized on his thin frame, the sleeves swallowing his hands. His sneakers were soaked from standing too long in the damp, and the straps of a backpack slipped from his shoulder with the fatigue of someone used to waiting. His face was pale, lips parted slightly, not in fear but in uncertainty, in the kind of cautious courage that comes only after deciding the moment is more important than the fear it brings. He held something in his hand, a folded note. I'm sorry, he said, voice barely audible above the mist. I know I'm not supposed to be here. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes told him it was okay to continue. I saw what you said in the hearing, the way you said it. I didn't think people, grown-ups, could talk like that. I didn't think they were allowed to. He looked away quickly, blinking fast, then held out the note like it weighed far too much for someone his age to carry alone. I just wanted to say thank you. The paper shook in his hand, crumpled slightly at the corners from being held too tight, too long. Jasmine stepped forward slowly, taking the note gently, her fingers brushing his for only a second, but enough to ground him. She didn't open it. Not yet. Some truths deserve silence before reading. Instead, she looked at him, truly looked at him. You didn't have to come, she said softly. I did, he whispered, eyes fixed on the ground. Because what you said, it made me feel like maybe I wasn't crazy. She felt the breath catch in her throat, not because of what he said, but because of what it meant. And in that fragile space between fear and freedom, Jasmine Crockett nodded. Not as a congresswoman, not as a public servant, but as someone who understood the unbearable cost of silence. Thank you for letting me hear you, she said. And in that moment, one voice in the mist became more powerful than all the silence inside the Capitol combined. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jasmine held the note delicately, her fingers resting on its creased fold, the weight of it heavier than any document she had presented on the floor that day. But she didn't open it. Not yet. She looked at the boy, really looked, and saw something in his posture she recognized too well. That fragile space between being brave and being broken. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. But his entire body stood like a question. Will this be the moment I regret trusting someone again? Jasmine didn't answer with words. She answered with presence. She lowered herself to one knee, not out of performance, not out of politics, but because this boy didn't need to look up at another adult. He needed someone to come down to his level and stay there. Her knees touched the cold stone, her coat brushing against the damp earth, but she didn't notice. She rested one hand gently on his, still clasping the note, and the other over his knuckles, grounding him. You don't have to carry that alone, she said, her voice no louder than the breeze drifting through the columns. His chin trembled just once, barely noticeable. But Jasmine saw it. She didn't squeeze his hand tighter. She just held it, firm but soft, the way someone does when they're not trying to fix a wound. just to let the person know it's real. No cameras caught this, no reporters jotted it down, but this was the soul of everything she had said inside that hearing room. Not the sound bites, not the questions, not even the confrontation. It was this quiet vow: you are not invisible, not anymore. She looked down at the note in her hand. Slowly, gently, she unfolded it, smoothing the creases like one would smooth the corner of a child's blanket. The handwriting was messy, a mix of lowercase and capitals, written fast, like it had been started and restarted a dozen times before this final version had made it into his pocket. It read, "I thought no one would ever believe us." That was it. One sentence, 7 words, but they carried 20 years of silence, of shame, of second-guessing. The us in the note stretched beyond Ohio State. It stretched across schools, locker rooms, basements, dorms, training centers. It was the collective voice of every boy who had once told himself to man up, to forget it happened, to not make trouble. Jasmine looked back at him. His eyes were wet now, but no tears had fallen, still too afraid of what vulnerability might cost him. She gave his hand one final press, then rose slowly, folding the note again and tucking it gently into her coat pocket. Not as evidence, not as proof, but as something sacred. "You were brave today," she said. "Don't ever forget that." He nodded barely. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away toward the edge of the plaza, where a woman, his guardian perhaps, stood waiting with arms folded, worry in her stance. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because someone had finally looked at him and stayed. The door to her office clicked shut behind her with the soft finality of a book being closed. Not the end of a story, but the closing of a chapter that would echo far longer than its pages. The hallway outside had already gone still for the night, lights dimmed to a soft hum. Inside, Jasmine didn't bother turning on the overhead fluorescents. She preferred the quiet glow of her desk lamp, the soft amber light pooling over the wood surface like a small sanctuary, carved out of stone and politics. She slid the folder from under her arm and set it gently on the desk. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The names, the testimonies, the faces, they lived in her now, not as headlines, not as legal exhibits, but as stories carried in the rhythm of her pulse. She sat down slowly, let her fingers trace the leather edge of the folder as if it were a wound that had finally begun to scar. There was no applause, no phone ringing with congratulations, and she was grateful for that. Because in this moment, what she needed wasn't noise. It was the stillness that comes after the storm, not because the sky is clear, but because she had survived it, and so had the truth. Her computer chimed once, then again, then again. She glanced at the screen. The inbox icon flashed red. Hundreds of unread messages, all arriving in the past few hours. But these weren't campaign updates or policy memos. The subject lines told her everything. "You spoke for me. I never thought someone would say it out loud. I was 15 when it happened. Thank you for not looking away." She clicked on the first one, then another. One came from a retired football coach in Montana. Another from a nurse in Pennsylvania. Another from a grandmother who said her grandson had whispered a name she'd never heard before. For the first time in 20 years. They didn't write to praise her politics. They didn't even mention party. They wrote because something in them had cracked open when she said the words they'd waited a lifetime to hear. And in that crack, the light finally came through. Jasmine leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath her. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, letting her breath settle. Her body ached, not from fatigue, but from the quiet strain of carrying something bigger than herself. Speaking the truth in a room that's been built to bury it doesn't make you feel powerful. It makes you feel raw, exposed, changed. But in that rawness, something unexpected waited. Not sorrow, not fear, clarity. Because real courage doesn't always come with a roar. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it sits in the back of a misty plaza. Sometimes it writes in shaky handwriting on a folded piece of paper. And sometimes it walks into an empty office at the end of a long day, lights a single lamp, and reminds you why you ever opened your mouth in the first place. She smiled then, small, tired but real. The inbox continued to fill behind her. But for now, Jasmine Crockett sat still, not victorious, but whole. Power rarely forgets by accident. It forgets by design. In institutions that carry the weight of law, legacy, or prestige, forgetting is a strategy, one refined over decades of scandal, crisis, and survival. The louder the truth knocks, the more politely the door remains closed. And when someone dares to force it open, what spills out isn't chaos. It's calculated denial. When Jim Jordan said, "I don't remember," he wasn't lying in the way people traditionally lie. He was invoking one of the most practiced lines in the script of institutional self-preservation. Not a flat denial, not a confession. Something vaguer, softer, more defensible. "I don't remember" sounds human. It gives just enough distance from guilt to survive the room without having to survive the truth. But behind that phrase lies something more dangerous than forgetfulness: permission. In politics, in universities, in churches, in corporations, in courts, the act of forgetting has become a shield. It says, yes, something happened. Yes, maybe people were harmed. But I'm not the villain. Not if I never really knew. But harm doesn't need a villain. It just needs a system willing to let silence speak for it. Institutional silence doesn't fall from the sky. It is built brick by brick from subtle choices, a warning memo that gets filed instead of flagged, a complaint that gets handled quietly, a hallway conversation remembered as not serious. Over time, these small omissions layer like sediment, and one day when someone finally holds up the fossilized truth, the people in power look and say, "That was so long ago. How can anyone be sure?" But the people who were hurt, they remember everything. That's the cruelty of this dynamic. The powerless are cursed with perfect memory, while the powerful are allowed the luxury of forgetfulness. A boy remembers every word of being dismissed, of being laughed at, of being told to man up. But the adult in the room who said it, he has the privilege of claiming he was too busy, too unaware, too far removed. That's how silence becomes complicity. Not because someone ordered it, but because too many people agreed to it passively. 1,000 tiny nods, averted gazes, shrugs, delays. Let someone else handle it. This could ruin someone's career. Are we sure this is even real? And just like that, justice gets rewritten, not as a duty, but as a risk. And yet, when Jasmine Crockett laid those names on the table, when she read their stories, played their voices, showed the memo with James D. Jordan in black and white ink, something cracked. Because she wasn't just challenging one man's memory. She was challenging the entire system's selective amnesia. And for once, it couldn't blink fast enough. People often ask why survivors don't speak up sooner. But maybe the better question is, why do institutions spend so much energy making sure they never want to? What Jasmine revealed wasn't just past pain. It was a mirror held up to every boardroom, every university office, every congressional committee that's ever chosen decorum over decency. And in that reflection, we saw the cost, not just of what was done, but of what was never stopped. Because the truth is, silence doesn't protect the innocent. It protects the powerful. And what they call forgetting, the rest of us remember forever. The days following the hearing unfolded like a slow-motion collision, measured, tense, and impossible to avoid. While social media and the public echoed with Jasmine Crockett's words, Capitol Hill responded with something colder: containment. The GOP machine moved quickly, not to address the substance of the hearing, but to reframe it. Press releases use phrases like coordinated ambush, unsubstantiated spectacle, and weaponization of trauma for partisan gain. One senior congressman appeared on cable news, shaking his head solemnly. "This is a dangerous precedent," he said. "We're turning oversight into political theater. Who's next?" Behind closed doors, the language was even sharper. Staffers were instructed to avoid comment. Messaging memos circulated advising colleagues to recenter the narrative and defend institutional integrity. The goal wasn't to refute the testimony. They couldn't. It was to discredit the moment, turn a moral reckoning into just another culture war skirmish, and above all, distance themselves from the fallout. Jim Jordan's name, once invoked with pride at committee meetings and fundraising dinners, suddenly disappeared from talking points. His planned appearances on Sunday shows were canceled without explanation. One by one, allies withdrew, not publicly, but noticeably. In politics, absence speaks louder than outrage. His chair at the next Judiciary Committee hearing sat empty. No statement, no substitution, just a silent space, like a placeholder for a truth no one wanted to address. But not everyone was willing to pretend. 3 days after the hearing, during a procedural vote on unrelated legislation, a freshman representative from the Pacific Northwest asked to speak. He wasn't known for drama. A former teacher elected on a platform of ethics reform, he rarely broke from script. But when he stood at the mic, the room shifted. "I wasn't planning to speak today," he began, his voice calm but charged. "But after what we witnessed in this chamber, I feel I have to." His words fell into the air not like protest but like confession. What we saw wasn't politics. It wasn't grandstanding. It was justice, raw, unapologetic, and long overdue. A few members shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes. But the young representative pressed on. "We talk about protecting institutions, but what's the value of an institution that can't look truth in the eye? That shrinks when victims finally speak? That pretends forgetting is the same as absolution?" He glanced at the empty chair, then back at his colleagues. "We have to be better than this." The room didn't applaud. Congress rarely rewards moral clarity, but something in the air changed. The script had cracked. The silence had been named. And while the official record would show nothing more than a few brief remarks from an obscure legislator, the moment rippled beneath the surface. Quiet, relentless, real. Because the truth was no longer confined to a single hearing. It had entered the bloodstream of the building. And though Jordan's chair remained empty, it had never said more. Back in her office, long after the final vote had been cast and the marble halls returned to their usual hum of low voices and rustling paper, Jasmine sat alone with the window cracked open. The breeze carried the faintest echo of chants from outside, faint enough to fade if she let herself forget. But she didn't want to forget. Not now, not ever. The soft flicker of the desk lamp pooled around her like a second skin, and in its glow she leaned back, eyes heavy but sharp, her thoughts too loud for the quiet that surrounded her. "I didn't speak to be clapped for," she whispered aloud to no one. "I spoke because no one else did." She repeated it again, this time slower, letting it sit in the still air. That truth, her truth, wasn't born on a stage or in a strategy session. It had been shaped over years of watching people look away, of sitting in courtrooms where victims left unheard, of listening to colleagues praise decorum while injustice bloomed just outside their polished doors. People had started calling her a hero. The inbox said it. The headlines hinted at it. The strangers in the hallway who nodded as she passed, their eyes wet with recognition. But Jasmine didn't feel like a hero, not in the cinematic, triumphal sense. If anything, she felt like something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. A mirror. That's all she had really been in that hearing room. Not a destroyer, not a savior, just a mirror, held up to a system that had built its power on the ability to turn away. She hadn't invented the truth she read aloud. She hadn't written the memo. She hadn't lived the trauma. But she had forced them to see it, line by line, name by name. No filter, no script, no safe distance. And mirrors don't lie. They don't apologize. They don't soften the angles. They reflect exactly what's there, no matter how grotesque, how broken, how long buried. That's why they're feared in places like Congress, because power can survive scandal. It can survive protest, but it struggles to survive its own reflection. She thought of Jordan's face when she asked him the simplest, most human question of all. Have you ever said, "I'm sorry"? Not for political theater, not for a soundbite, but because in that moment, it was the only question that mattered. And he couldn't answer it. Not really, because to answer would be to see himself. And people like him had made a career out of avoiding the mirror. She stood and crossed the room to the window. Outside, the dome of the Capitol glowed white against the night sky. Silent, beautiful, indifferent. Jasmine watched it for a long time, arms folded, jaw set. Then she turned back toward her desk, toward the pile of names she still hadn't filed away. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She didn't want monuments or murals or book deals. She wanted eye contact, accountability, a system brave enough to look at itself and not flinch. Because mirrors are dangerous, but only to those afraid of what they've become. 10 days had passed since Jasmine Crockett laid the truth bare on the table of the House Judiciary Committee. 10 days since Jim Jordan failed to answer a question that a decent man could have whispered in one breath. And in Washington, the silence still lingered. Not the kind born of reverence, but the kind that comes when power doesn't know what to say, when it chooses inertia over reflection. The halls of Congress had returned to routine. The same marble, the same protocol, the same carefully orchestrated performances. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier, more watched. Jordan's chair remained empty. No public statement, no resolution, just that empty seat, silent testimony to what happens when the truth arrives uninvited. But outside the Capitol, the silence did not survive. Across the country, voices were rising, not in chaos, not in protest, but in something far more enduring: connection. In Chicago, a college student performed a spoken word piece titled, "What the Mirror Showed Us." In Portland, a mural appeared overnight on the side of a downtown building. Jasmine, her head bowed, her hands placing a single page on a table. In bold white letters above it, the words, "This happened to me." And online, the moment kept looping, again and again. A stitched tick-tock, barely 30 seconds long, became the new anthem for a generation raised on both trauma and truth. It opened with Jasmine's hand sliding the page across the polished oak, the paper gliding like it carried 1,000 lives. A soft piano score played beneath it. Then her voice, "They don't need you to remember. They need your accountability." The clip faded to black. Then white text appeared, simple and devastating. You didn't need power. You just needed to care. Within hours, it had 10 million views. By day 3, it passed 50. Not because it was viral, but because it was necessary. People weren't just watching. They were feeling, some for the first time in years. Underneath the comments were stories, anonymous confessions, fragments of pain released like breath. "I was 14. I told a teacher. She told me to stop lying. My coach laughed when I told him. I never played again. My son tried to tell me. I didn't believe him. I do now." Jasmine didn't respond to every message. She couldn't, but she read them, late at night, alone, in the quiet corners between policy meetings and committee prep. And every time she thought the wave might finally subside, it rose again. Not with rage, but with something deeper, relief, that someone, somewhere, had finally said it out loud. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about healing. And healing isn't loud. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't pass resolutions. It flickers like a candle. It sits in the hand of a boy who steps out from behind a marble pillar. It glows from a phone screen in a quiet bedroom where someone finally hears, "You're not crazy. You're not alone. You are seen." The lasting flame wasn't Jasmine's voice. It was what it ignited. Because once people realize that truth can live without permission, they stop asking for it, and they start living it. The town hall was small, almost forgettable. A converted gymnasium in a community center on the south side of town. Its folding chairs slightly uneven. The stage little more than a raised platform with a makeshift podium. No national cameras, no press pool. Just a few hundred people packed tightly into the warmth of one another's attention. Elderly women fanned themselves with pamphlets. Retired teachers clutched notebooks. A single mother in the back rocked a stroller with her foot while adjusting a worn campaign button on her sweater. Jasmine Crockett stood at the front, not in her tailored blazer from Capitol Hill, but in rolled-up sleeves and worn heels. Her voice, when it came, didn't carry the polish of performance. It carried something far heavier: urgency. "I've heard a lot of people tell me lately that what I said in that hearing was powerful," she began, scanning the room slowly. "But I'm going to be honest with you tonight. I don't care if you thought it was powerful." A hush fell. Not offended, just stunned. She stepped forward. I don't need you to clap. I need you to act. There was a shift in the room then. Shoulders straightened, phones lowered. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but it carved through the space with purpose. Don't repost what I said if you're not willing to write a letter to your school board. Don't quote my words if you're not going to show up for the next vote. Don't say that was brave if you're not willing to call out the silence when it happens in your own community. She paused and let the quiet bloom. Power doesn't change because you feel inspired, she said, her tone like flint striking stone. It changes because you apply pressure. Consistent, collective, unapologetic pressure. From the side of the room, a teenager, barely 16, whispered to the person beside him, not realizing how clearly his voice would carry. I thought I was the only one. Jasmine heard it, her head turned gently in his direction. She didn't call him out. She didn't spotlight him. She simply let the words breathe in the air, as if blessing them. She continued, but now with a softened edge. That's the most dangerous lie we're ever told, she said. That we're alone. That our story doesn't matter. That if we speak up, we'll stand in the dark by ourselves. Her gaze swept across the room, pausing on each face just long enough to be felt. But here's the truth. Every time one person dares to speak, someone else takes one step out of the dark. And that's how we win. Not with noise, not with tweets, but with people who refuse to sit down when it's uncomfortable. With people who choose to care when it's easier not to. A hand went up in the crowd, then another, not to ask questions, just to hold space. Jasmine looked out over them, the lights casting soft halos across faces weathered by years of waiting for someone to say what they'd always known. Don't clap, she said one last time, almost a whisper now. Be the pressure. Long after the lights dimmed and the echoes of applause faded into memory, Jasmine Crockett sat alone once more, this time not in her office, but in a quiet room behind the stage of that small town hall. The chairs were being stacked outside. The janitor had begun sweeping, but she wasn't ready to move yet. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. Another message. Another forwarded clip of her words stitched into someone's video essay. Another reminder that the moment hadn't passed. It had simply taken root. She folded her hands in her lap, eyes fixed on a single flickering light above. Then, almost without thinking, she whispered aloud the truth she had carried since the beginning. Not for anyone else, but for herself. Justice is not a verdict. It's a decision. Not a conclusion reached by gavels or votes, not a trophy handed down by pundits or headlines. It was a choice, made every day, in meetings, in classrooms, in locker rooms, in moments where it would be easier, safer to look away. Justice lived in those small, invisible forks in the road, where someone decided to listen instead of dismiss, to believe instead of doubt, to act instead of shrink. She thought of the boy behind the pillar, the way he held that folded note like it carried more weight than his own body, the way his eyes darted, not in fear of her, but in fear of being seen and then dismissed, the cruelest wound of all. But when he stepped forward, when he pressed the letter into her hand and whispered, "Thank you," something changed, not just in him, but in her. And days later, when she saw him again, not in person, but in a grainy photo someone had taken as he left the Capitol, she noticed it. His shoulders were straighter. His eyes, though still cautious, held a glint of something unfamiliar to him before that night. Recognition of self, of worth, of the dangerous, liberating possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry his silence anymore. Jasmine stood and gathered her things. She moved slowly, not out of exhaustion, but reverence. This wasn't just the end of a speech or a campaign or a hearing. It was the close of something more intimate, the moment when a truth once hidden had finally been said, and now the world had to decide what to do with it. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the knob. She thought of the names, the faces, the survivors, the boy, the seat Jim Jordan still hadn't returned to. And then she turned slightly, as if speaking to someone just behind her, though the room was empty. "What will you choose to remember?" she asked. Not as a challenge, not even as a plea, but as an invocation, because memory, like silence, is never neutral. And when truth is finally spoken aloud, it doesn't ask for permission, it asks for witness. What we choose to remember becomes who we are, not as nations or parties or institutions, but as people. People who wake up every day with the chance to look away or to look closer. Jasmine Crockett didn't break the world open. She simply refused to let it stay sealed. She didn't invent the pain, the silence, the betrayal. She illuminated it, and in doing so, she gave others permission to speak, to stand, to heal. The names laid across that table were not history, they were warnings. And the most dangerous thing we can do with a warning is file it away until the next tragedy reminds us we already knew. This story is not about a hero, it's about a mirror. And what we see in it will depend not on who Jasmine Crockett is, but on who we choose to become. Let it be known that the power to protect, to speak, to believe, does not rest in title or tenure. It lives in ordinary people who refuse to let truth go unanswered. In a boy with a note in his hand, in a whisper that says, "Me too." In someone who doesn't need power, just the courage to care. This narrative contains elements derived from publicly available hearings and media footage, used here under fair use for purposes of commentary, education, and transformative storytelling. Names and testimonies, where included, serve not to dramatize pain, but to honor those who lived it and dared to remember. Because in the end, justice is not sealed in marble or framed in applause. It is the decision to remember, out loud. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.